An elderly woman was abandoned at a nursing home on her 80th birthday, but when her children read the will, they were in shock. The morning sun cast a golden glow on the nursing home windows, sending beams of light across the polished floor of the entrance hall. The place was quiet, with a faint scent of lavender mixed with a metallic smell of cleaning products. Mrs. Celia looked around, feeling disoriented and abandoned. The weight of what was happening didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to dig deeper into her soul with each passing second. She looked at her children, Andre, Paolo, and Juliana, hoping to find some hint of compassion or regret in their eyes. But they seemed strangely distant, as if they were already somewhere else, preoccupied with commitments that didn't include their mother. Andre, the eldest, stood with his arms crossed, his face austere. Paolo, always restless, checked his phone every minute, as if time there was being taken from a precious schedule. Juliana, the youngest, looked away, pretending to be interested in a plant near the reception, perhaps to avoid a silent confrontation with Mrs. Celia's teary eyes. When the director of the nursing home arrived, a short man with a formal expression, holding a clipboard with the admission documents, Mrs. Celia's children approached to sign quickly, not even paying attention to the explanations about how the facility operated. "It's for your own good, Mom," murmured Juliana, her voice barely hiding the discomfort. She tried to smile weakly, but it faded before it fully formed. Juliana looked away, focusing on a random spot on the wall, as if the weight of guilt could be avoided by simply not facing reality. Mrs. Celia sighed, her trembling voice trying to break the silence. I thought we were going to celebrate my birthday together. We've always done something special, remember?" Her voice was a broken whisper, a final attempt to appeal to the affection that, at one time, she believed was genuine. Paolo let out an impatient sigh, and without looking up from his phone, he replied with a coldness that cut like a knife. "Mom, you need care that we can't give you. Here, you'll be safe, well taken care of." He didn't even bother to offer a warmer explanation, as if he'd already rehearsed that empty justification to cover up his own indifference. "Yes, Mom," Andre added, his voice laced with forced authority. "We're doing this for you. You have to understand that we're not kids anymore who rely on you all the time." Mrs. Celia closed her eyes, feeling the words hit her heart like silent blows. For a moment, she thought about arguing, about reminding each of them of the times she'd had to sacrifice her own dreams and health to put them on the right path, to ensure they had everything she never did. But as she looked at each of their faces, she saw only an impenetrable wall of coldness and detachment. It was as if those three strangers standing in front of her weren't the same children she had once held in her arms, whispering promises of eternal love between kisses and tears. Once the papers were signed, the three siblings made a move to say goodbye. Juliana took a step forward, as if she were going to hug her mother, but then held back when she noticed the impatient look from her brothers. "Take care, Mom," she said, almost mechanically, trying to smile without much conviction. Then, without waiting for a response, she turned to join her brothers on their way out. Mrs. Celia reached out her hand, almost in a pleading gesture, but her children were already walking quickly outside. She watched them disappear through the main door, their silhouettes fading into the morning light. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the hallway until silence filled the space once more, a deafening emptiness. She stood there for a few minutes, still looking at the door, with a faint, absurd hope that maybe they would turn back. But nothing happened. Only silence filled the room, and loneliness wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. With a lump in her throat and a silent tear streaming down her face, Mrs. Celia murmured, almost like a prayer, "My God, give me strength to endure this. I just wanted to spend this day with my family." A nurse approached, smiling gently. "Mrs. Celia, would you like to see your room?" I'm sure you'll like it. The window has a lovely view of the garden." Mrs. Celia nodded, still in shock, and followed her through the corridors. She barely noticed the walls adorned with floral paintings or the soft scent of flowers wafting in from the garden. She was lost in a whirlwind of emotions, a mix of sadness, disbelief, and an emptiness she couldn't quite name. When she entered the room, she looked around, noticing the few pieces of furniture, the bed covered by a simple comforter, and a small table with a chair next to the window. On the windowsill, a few wilted flowers in a vase seemed to perfectly symbolize how she felt at that moment. With a deep sigh, she sat on the edge of the bed and let her gaze drift out the window, looking at the gate in the distance where her children had left. It was a birthday she would never forget, but not for the reasons she once dreamed of. There, in that solitary room, she realized that something in her life, something essential and precious, had broken. But in silence, she closed her eyes and murmured a prayer. "Lord, I don't know what the future holds for me, but give me strength and patience, for I am alone now. And even alone, I am still your daughter." The loneliness of that day was bitter, but a hidden strength was growing in her heart, like a seed planted in hard soil. She knew something would change. She just didn't know how or when. Donna Celia's first night in the nursing home fell slow and heavy. The hallway lights flickered now and then, casting strange shadows on the ceiling, and the distant sound of footsteps echoed like a constant reminder that here, silence was part of the routine. She tried to sleep, but the weight of memories kept her awake, squeezing her heart with a mix of sadness and nostalgia. Lying in bed, her eyes lost on the ceiling, she allowed herself to dive into her memories. She thought of her husband, Enrique, a good and devoted man who'd left too soon, leaving her alone to raise 3 children. She still remembered the devastating pain of the day she received the news of his work accident, the despair of facing life as both mother and father. Enrique had been her first and only love, and when he was gone, she found strength only because she knew she had to live for her children. The memories played before her eyes like scenes from an old film. She pictured herself younger, walking through the small, modest house they had bought with so much sacrifice. Celia smiled, remembering the morning she would wake up before sunrise, preparing the children's packed lunches, making sure each one had something to take to school. She remembered how Andre was always the first to wake up, helping her set the breakfast table, while Paolo usually complained about the cold and stayed wrapped in his blankets a few more minutes. Juliana, being the youngest, demanded the most attention, and Celia did everything she could to make sure the little one didn't feel the absence of a father she barely got to know. All these images came with memories of sacrifice. She had given up any hope of fulfilling personal dreams. Money, which was always tight, went entirely to the children's education, the rent, and the books they needed. She worked as a cleaner, cook, laundress, and even a helper at a local market, standing for hours to ensure her children lacked nothing. No matter how tired she was, she always came home with a smile, trying to show them that, despite everything, life could still be beautiful. But now, she thought bitterly, what was the point of all those years of effort? She had raised them to be good and generous, but what she saw on her children's faces during that last visit was only coldness and ingratitude. Where along the way had love been lost? Where did she fail? What word or gesture was missing for them to understand the importance of the bonds that held them together? "Lord," she murmured softly, her eyes wet with tears, "what did I do wrong?" The room remained dark and silent, but the memories kept weighing on her chest. On a rainy night many years ago, Juliana had a high fever. Celia ran through the wet streets with her daughter in her arms, under a storm, to the small neighborhood hospital. She stayed by her bedside for hours, sleepless, praying for the fever to go down. And it did. She remembered Paolo, who once needed help with school. He wanted to quit because he was teased for wearing simple clothes, and she spent an entire night beside him, encouraging him, promising that one day it would all make sense. And Andre, who wanted a guitar so badly that she saved every penny she could until she could buy one, just to see him smile. Each child carried a part of her heart, but now, there, in that cold and empty bed, she wondered if any of them understood that. If any of them remembered all the promises she had made to herself while raising them, that she would always be there for them, that they would never lack love. The clock on the wall ticked softly, filling the emptiness of the room. She shifted, lying on her side and hugging the pillow as if somehow she could find comfort in that solitary gesture. She closed her eyes and in the darkness, pictured the living room of her old house. That room had been the heart of the home, with the worn-out sofas and the old radio that played music on Sundays while she cooked lunch. How could she have imagined that one day her children would see her as a burden? Burden, the word echoed painfully in her mind. She had never thought that the love she had poured into them with such dedication could one day be seen as something disposable, like an inconvenient responsibility that could simply be left behind. She thought of the last thing Paolo said before he left. "Here, you'll be safe, Mom. There will be people to take care of you." He spoke as if caring for his mother was a task only professionals should handle, as if a son's love and duty were luxuries they could no longer afford. She wondered how many other mothers and fathers were in that same situation, forgotten by their children, left in nursing homes or assisted living facilities like old belongings. "What would you do, Enrique?" she whispered softly, remembering her husband's calm face. She knew he would never have let this happen, that if he were alive, their children would never act this way. Tears rolled down her wrinkled face, and she sobbed quietly, wrapped in the dimness of the room. Despite the hurt, Celia also felt a deep sadness, a sense of emptiness that seemed to swallow everything she had once believed about family love. So many years of dedication and sacrifice. Had it all been in vain? She allowed herself to cry that first night, alone, until fatigue finally weighed on her eyelids. When sleep came, it was restless, full of confusing dreams, where she saw her children as young kids again, smiling at her, holding her hands with their tiny fingers, promising in their little voices that they would always be together. But upon waking, the reality was cold and empty. The silence in the room was a grim answer, as if the walls echoed her own fears. Still, somewhere in her heart, a small spark of hope stubbornly resisted. She didn't know how, but she promised herself that she would find a way to find peace, even in this unexpected situation. As the hallway lights flickered on and off, Mrs. Celia closed her eyes, determined to endure. She knew God was with her, even if her children weren't. Deep down, an intuition whispered that this journey, however bitter it seemed, would still lead her to something greater. As Mrs. Celia tried to adapt to the empty, silent days in the nursing home, her children went on with their lives, relieved of a responsibility that, to them, felt like nothing but a burden. One Sunday afternoon, just days after leaving their mother at the nursing home, Andre, Paolo, and Juliana gathered at Andre's house to discuss an important matter: the division of Mrs. Celia's assets. Andre's house was a modern construction, quite different from the modest home they had grown up in. It seemed to reflect his own practical and ambitious personality, with minimalist furniture and no visible memories of the past. Juliana arrived first, with an anxious expression and a hint of hesitation. Paolo, who had always been the most impulsive, came in shortly after, shutting the door with a slight bang and carrying a folder with documents he thought were necessary for this family discussion. Andre greeted them with a brief nod, his expression impassive. After a few minutes of small talk, he got straight to the point. "We need to decide what we're going to do with our mother's house," Andre began, without beating around the bush. "With her in the nursing home, there's no reason to leave it empty. I've been thinking we could sell it, and each of us would get a share." Juliana frowned, her eyes darting between her brothers. "Sell the house? But it's the house we grew up in. And what if she doesn't like that?" Paolo sighed impatiently. "Juliana, let's be practical. Do you really think she'll still care about that? Our mother doesn't even need the house anymore. She can barely take care of herself. You've seen how she is. We need to stop acting like we're kids holding on to the past." Andre nodded, ever meticulous and calculating, as if he were handling any other transaction. "Besides, the nursing home costs are high, and she doesn't have much income. It won't be long before we'll have to help cover her expenses. And honestly, I'm not in a position to do that." "Neither am I," added Paolo, crossing his arms. "With my share of the house, I can take care of my debts. Things at work haven't been easy at all, and I'm already drowning in overdue bills. That money will help me breathe a little." Juliana, more sensitive than her siblings, hesitated. Ever since they left the house where they grew up, she'd held onto a kind of nostalgic fondness for the place. She remembered how their mother insisted on keeping the house spotless, even when money was tight and the furniture was old. She remembered the Sunday lunches, the smell of cornmeal cake that Donna Celia insisted on baking to welcome them, even as adults. But when she met the determined looks of her siblings, she felt cornered. "I understand, but selling it like this, without even talking to her about it first," Juliana began, but her voice was cut off by Paolo's harsh tone. "Talk about what, Juliana? Do you really think she'll understand? If we leave this decision to her, she'll just get attached and refuse to sell. And then, who's going to cover her expenses? You." Juliana looked down, uncomfortable. She knew she didn't have the resources to help with the nursing home costs and felt the pressure from her siblings to go along with the decision. But something inside her stirred, a sense that they were betraying their mother's trust. The same mother who had said so many times that everything she had was for them. Andre leaned forward, placing his hand on the table, and spoke firmly. "Look, Juliana, we have to be practical. The house is a large property worth good money. She's not going to use it anymore, and we need that financial stability. It's not like we're doing something wrong. After all, we're the heirs. We have the right." The word heirs echoed through the room like a cold, final statement. There was no sentiment there, just a fact that seemed to justify any decision in their minds. Juliana pressed her lips together, trying to stifle the growing discomfort. Paolo, noticing his sister's silence, continued, almost in a conciliatory tone. "Listen, sis, we're not saying she doesn't deserve our respect. We just need to be rational. She's well taken care of at the home, with nurses, medical care, things none of us can provide. We already did what we had to do by placing her there, so there's no point in dragging this out." Juliana nodded, still hesitant. She couldn't deny that the money from selling the house would really help. She and her husband were in debt, and her salary barely covered the month's expenses. But still, the idea of simply letting go of the house without consulting her mother felt like a betrayal. Andre, sensing that they'd convinced Juliana, concluded, "So that's it. I can handle contacting a real estate agent and arrange everything. The three of us will split the amount, and each one can do what they think is best with their share. This way, at least we have some security." An uncomfortable silence settled in the room, broken only by the sound of Paolo tapping his fingers on the table, eager to end the discussion and move on. Juliana looked out the window, distracted, as if something inside her was still fighting against agreeing with it all. She felt a sense of anguish, but was confused, pressured by her siblings' firm and determined looks. And what about her savings? Juliana asked in a low voice. Could she have any money put aside? I always thought our mother was pretty organized with that kind of thing. Paolo gave a cynical laugh. Savings? Do you know how much she made with those cleaning jobs? Of course, there's nothing saved up. If there were, we know by now. Andre nodded in agreement. Probably whatever little she has will go toward the expenses of the nursing home. We can't count on that. Juliana nodded again, but her gaze was distant. She thought of her mother, now alone in an unfamiliar place, without the home she'd spent her life building for them. A pang of guilt crept into her heart, but she pushed the thought away. After all, her brothers were right. That's what she told herself, as if trying to quiet her own conscience. It was a practical issue, a rational decision, and she couldn't allow nostalgia or guilt to influence a decision that, in her brother's eyes, was so clear-cut. So it's settled, Andre said, getting up, ending the meeting. I'll handle everything. You just need to sign the paperwork when the time comes. Juliana rose in silence, still unsure if she felt relief or a heavy heart. While Paolo and Andre exchanged a few last words about the real estate market, she was already heading towards the exit, carrying the weight of a decision she knew was practical, but felt cold and distant from everything her mother represented. As she walked out the door, she looked back one last time, and for a brief moment, a disturbing doubt crossed her mind. Were they really doing the best for their mother? But before she could delve deeper into these thoughts, Paolo called her to the car, and the reflection faded into the noise of daily life. Far away, unaware of the discussions her children were having about the house, Donna Celia was preparing for another lonely night at the nursing home, still trying to find peace in a wounded heart and gather strength from memories her children, unknowingly, had already begun to let go. The first few days of the nursing home were hard for Donna Celia. The impersonal silence, the smell of medicine mixed with the faint scent of wilting flowers, and the strict routine made her feel out of place, like a piece of a puzzle that would never quite fit. She missed the noise of her children, Paolo's impromptu visits, her casual chats with Juliana, and even Andre's straightforward advice, no matter how harsh it could be at times. Now, the presence of her children had been replaced by unfamiliar faces and distant glances. But little by little, her sadness began to find small refuges. On those long, empty mornings, Donna Celia began to walk through the nursing home's hallways and explore the small garden in the back, a corner of peace surrounded by unkempt rose bushes and old trees. It was on one of those solitary walks that she met Donna Helena. Donna Helena was a woman with a deep gaze, gray hair tied in a loose bun, and a smile that held an uncommon serenity. Seeing Donna Celia sitting on a bench, looking at the flowers with a sad expression, Donna Helena quietly approached, sitting next to her with the ease of someone who already understands that in a place like that, no one is truly alone. You must be new here, said Helena with a gentle smile. I noticed you walking around. With a look I know well. Donna Celia tried to smile, but it was a weak attempt that faded before it even reached her eyes. I just got here. It was my children's decision, she confessed softly, as if she was still digesting the weight of those words. Helena nodded understandingly and gently placed a hand over hers. Most of us came here because of someone else's decision. Children, nieces, distant relatives. But over time, we learned that it's not always a tragedy. Sometimes, God places us on paths we don't understand, but that have a purpose. That phrase lingered in Donna Celia's mind, like a new perspective she had never considered. I still don't understand, she admitted, her voice trembling. I did so much for them. I devoted myself, gave everything I could, and now I feel like a burden they wanted to get rid of. Helena squeezed her hand gently and looked at her with an almost motherly affection. I understand that pain well, my dear. Most of us here carry similar stories, but sometimes life makes us take a few steps back so we can see the whole picture. You believe in God, don't you? Dona Celia nodded, a silent tear slipping down her face. Yes, I've always trusted that he would give me strength. But lately, I wonder if maybe I've been forgotten. Helena smiled tenderly. As someone who understands doubt, but knows the answer goes beyond what can be seen or touched. My dear, God never forgets his children. Sometimes he places us in the shadows so we can see the light in a different way. Pain teaches us things that often love doesn't show us. I've been through many difficult times, too. I lost my husband, then a child, and today I'm here with only these memories. But I've found peace, and maybe you can find it too. Dona Celia looked at Helena attentively. There was something in those words that brought her a calmness she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a simple, unassuming wisdom, yet profound. There was a light in those aged eyes, a light that seemed to shine from within, a kind of serenity known only to those who have faced many storms. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the leaves sway in the trees and the flight of a few birds that landed on the ground, carefree. It was a simple moment, but in that peace, Dona Celia felt for the first time a little less alone. In the days that followed, Dona Celia and Dona Helena became inseparable friends. They talked about everything, the past, their dreams, and even the disappointments they carried in their hearts. Helena spoke in a calm, soothing voice, and each word seemed to be filled with meaning. She shared stories of faith, the lessons she'd learned over her life, and how she had discovered that the true value of things wasn't in material possessions or achievements, but in moments of love and acts of kindness. "We are all pilgrims," Helena said one rainy afternoon as they sipped tea. "We're just passing through. The things we accumulate, the possessions, the property, none of it truly belongs to us. What we carry with us are memories, loves, the acts of kindness we spread throughout the world. In the end, that's all that really matters." Dona Celia listened in silence, absorbing every word. It was as if, by hearing these stories, she felt her own heart begin to heal, piece by piece. She found, in Helena's kindness and in the conversations they shared, a hope she thought she had lost. The nursing home, which once felt like a prison, started to transform into a refuge, a place where she could reflect on her life and find some meaning amid the pain of abandonment. One especially quiet night, during one of their talks in the soft light of the room, Helena touched on a subject that Dona Celia had been avoiding, but that seemed to linger in her mind like an open wound. "Have you thought about forgiving your children?" Helena asked, almost casually, but with a depth that cut through Celia like a gentle blade. Dona Celia was silent, staring into the distance. Forgive them? The idea seemed unreachable. She felt that, by abandoning their mother, her children had broken something precious, something she didn't know could ever be restored. But at the same time, the pain of holding onto that resentment weighed on her chest. It was like a rock slowly suffocating her. I'm not sure I can," she admitted, her voice choked. "It's like I invested everything I had in them, all my love, my time, my life. And now, I feel like none of it mattered." Helena smiled understandingly and placed her hand on Celia's, offering her comfort. "My dear, forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. Holding on to this resentment will only harm you. You're carrying a weight that's unnecessary. Sometimes we have to let go of expectations to understand that love by nature is a gift. We gave them the best we had, and that's enough. If they don't appreciate it, that's not our problem." Mrs. Celia let Helena's words resonate in her heart. Something inside her started to shift at that moment. The idea of forgiveness no longer seemed so far off, though it was still difficult. Maybe forgiving was the only way to free herself from the past and allow something new to grow within her. The days continued to pass, and Mrs. Celia found in her friendship with Mrs. Helena an unexpected renewal of her faith. During her nightly prayers, she no longer asked for answers, but for the serenity to accept the paths that life had set for her. With each conversation, each shared confidence, Celia felt her heart soften, and little by little, her sadness transformed into something she couldn't describe, but which carried a hint of peace. And in that newfound peace, Mrs. Celia began to glimpse a strength she hadn't believed she possessed for a long time. One quiet evening, as a gentle breeze drifted through her bedroom window, Mrs. Celia sat down to organize her few belongings. It was a kind of ritual for her, a way to bring some order to a life that in recent months had become chaotic and confusing. In a small wooden box were stored documents, old photographs, and small keepsakes from her children's childhoods. A lock of Juliana's hair, Andre's first report card, a birthday card Paolo had made for her with his own hands. As she sifted through the box, her fingers touched an old, worn envelope that immediately brought back memories. It was the will she had written years earlier, after her husband Enrique's passing. At the time, with her children still young, she had feared that something might happen to her and wanted to ensure that everything she and Enrique had built would go to them. The document had been written with love and a sense of certainty that she was protecting her children's future. She carefully took the envelope from the box and opened it. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn, but the words were still clear. On impulse, she began to read what she had written so many years ago, and each line brought back memories of a mother full of hopes and plans for her children. In the will, she declared that the house where they had grown up, the modest little home she and Enrique had built with so much effort, and all her savings would be divided equally among Andre, Paolo, and Juliana. But there was one clause that almost no one knew about, a condition she had included at the suggestion of Enrique's old lawyer. A clause that, at the time, seemed like a mere formality, something she never thought would actually matter. This clause stated that a considerable portion of her inheritance, kept in a separate bank account, would only be made available to her children if they showed love and care for their mother during the final years of her life. Those words now seemed almost prophetic, as if her past self had foreseen the possibility of abandonment, of ingratitude. Back then, she had included the clause as a kind of protection, but she never thought she would truly need it. To Mrs. Celia, the idea that her children wouldn't be by her side in her old age had been unthinkable. Her heart tightened as she remembered the face of each of her children on the day they left her at the nursing home. Paolo's cold words, Andre's impatience, and Juliana's evasive gaze. It all seemed like confirmation that the love and care she expected from them had turned into a sort of empty transaction, devoid of any emotional bond. In that moment, the clause that once seemed like a formality revealed itself as a bitter truth. They hadn't honored what she had sincerely asked of them. Dona Celia sat in silence, the paper between her trembling fingers, with a mix of sadness, disappointment, and an unknown strength taking over her. She then realized that maybe it was time to make a definitive change. Her friendship with Dona Helena, the conversations about forgiveness and purpose, all the nights she had prayed for guidance. Everything seemed to converge toward that very moment. The next morning, first thing, Dona Celia sought out the nursing home's lawyer. His name was Dr. Roberto, a middle-aged man with a deep voice and restrained gestures, who volunteered his legal services to the residents every Wednesday. He welcomed her into his small office with kindness, noticing the serious and determined expression on Dona Celia's face. "How can I help you, Dona Celia?" he asked after inviting her to sit down. She took the folded will from her bag and placed it on the table between them. "I need to make some changes to my will, Doctor," The lawyer raised his eyebrows, surprised. It wasn't uncommon for residents to want to adjust their wills, but something in Donna Celia's tone told him that this wasn't a simple alteration. She took a deep breath and explained, "I have 3 children, doctor, and for a long time, I thought I would leave everything I have to them. But things have changed. Over the past few months, I've come to realize that there are people who genuinely care about me, who treat me with dignity and kindness, much more than those who should." Dr. Roberto listened attentively, leaning forward slightly, with respect and seriousness. He could feel the emotional weight behind each of her words and understood that this wasn't an easy decision. "I would like to make a new will," Donna Celia continued, her voice now firmer. "I want to leave my house and all my savings to charitable organizations, and a portion to the nursing home for them to use as they see fit. I want the rest to go to those who have helped me and shown me kindness here. The nurses, the caregivers, people who, though they haven't known me for long, have treated me as part of a family." Dr. Roberto nodded slowly, taking in what she was saying. "That's a brave decision, Mrs. Celia. And from what I can see, it's something you've thought about deeply. Do your children know about your intentions?" She shook her head, her gaze steady, but with a hint of sadness in her eyes. "No, and I don't think they would care, except perhaps for the money. But I've learned something important in these past days. True love isn't bought. It's not an obligation. Love is given from the heart, and that's the love I want to give back. I won't leave anything for those who abandoned me when I needed them most." Dr. Roberto remained silent for a moment, reflecting on her words. There was something inspiring in that decision, a strength he rarely saw. She wasn't acting out of revenge, but rather from a need for personal justice, a desire to honor the kindness she had received from strangers who treated her with respect and dignity. "I can draft the new will for you," he said, taking a notepad, "but I'd like you to think it over carefully. It's an important decision, and once it's finalized, it's irrevocable." Mrs. Celia nodded with a slight smile. "I've thought it over a lot, doctor, and I know I'm at peace with this choice." As Dr. Roberto began drafting the new will, Mrs. Celia felt an unexpected lightness, as if an old weight was being lifted from her shoulders. She knew this decision wouldn't erase the pain of abandonment, but somehow it felt like the right step toward her own healing. It wasn't about punishing her children. It was about recognizing the value of the love she had found in that place. After an hour of conversation and revisions, the new will was ready. With steady hands, she signed the document, sealing her decision. As she left Dr. Roberto's office, she felt her heart lighter than it had been since she arrived at the nursing home. That night, as she lay down, Mrs. Celia looked out the window and felt that, somehow, Enrique would be proud of her. In the darkness of her room, she offered a silent prayer, asking God to guide her children and help them understand the true meaning of love. She knew that, one day, they would have to face the consequences of their choices, but it was no longer her responsibility. She had left that task to fate and finally felt at peace. And in the stillness of that night, Mrs. Celia fell asleep peacefully, with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. The days following the signing of the new will brought an unexpected serenity to Mrs. Celia. Her routine in the nursing home was simple, but there was something liberating in knowing that, at last, her fate was in her own hands. Each morning, she awoke with a renewed purpose, a sense of peace that warmed her heart. The decision to leave her belongings to those who had truly treated her with dignity and kindness not only brought her relief, but also a feeling that she was, in some way, closing a chapter. Even so, one last task remained for her, one last adjustment that she felt was necessary before completely closing that chapter with her children. Accompanied by Mrs. Helena, her inseparable friend, Celia went to the small chapel of the nursing home on a Sunday morning. The chapel was simple, with wooden pews that creaked under the visitors' weight and walls decorated with images of saints. The soft light streaming through the stained glass windows painted the floor in vibrant colors, creating an atmosphere of peace and reflection. "Helena," Mrs. Celia began in a quiet voice, "I feel like I need to do something before it all ends. I don't want to leave with this weight on my heart." Mrs. Helena, listening with patience, nodded and smiled. "You're talking about forgiveness, aren't you?" Mrs. Celia sighed, hesitating. "Yes, it's not easy. I feel like they hurt me deeply, and I still carry that pain, even after all I've done. I thought changing my will would bring me peace, and it did, in a way. But something tells me it's not enough, that there's something more I need to do." Helena placed her hand on hers, a silent gesture of support. "Forgiveness, my dear, is the final step to your freedom. It's not easy, but it's a gift you give yourself. Not for others, but for yourself." Mrs. Celia closed her eyes, absorbing those words. Silently, she said a prayer, asking for strength to move forward with what she felt was her last mission. Inspired by this new perspective, she decided to take one more step in her choice, a final step which she hoped would bring her complete peace. The next day, Mrs. Celia asked the nursing home director to call Dr. Roberto, the lawyer. She wanted to make one last addition to her will, a decision that, for her, was the true proof of her acceptance and the path of forgiveness she had chosen to follow. When the lawyer arrived, she greeted him with a calm smile and spoke of her decision with firmness and conviction. "Dr. Roberto," she began, "I would like to add something to my will. The majority of the inheritance is still destined for the nursing home, charitable institutions, and the people who have taken care of me here. I won't change that. But I want my children to have something, a symbolic amount, so they know that, even with the pain they've caused, I still love them." The lawyer looked at her in surprise, and a gentle smile of understanding crossed his face. "And what exactly would you like to leave for them?" Mrs. Celia thought for a moment, her eyes shining with a serenity that the lawyer rarely saw in his clients. "I want them to receive a small amount, but I want them to receive a letter with it. A letter written by me, explaining everything I felt and the reason why I made this decision. I want them to know that I forgive them, but that love is a choice, and that they need to learn the value of genuine love, not the kind that expects something in return." Dr. Roberto nodded, admiring the determination and generosity of Mrs. Celia. "I can handle that for you, and if you'd like, I could help you write the letter." Mrs. Celia smiled, touched by the lawyer's kindness. "Thank you, doctor, but this letter I need to write on my own. These are words that come from my heart. It's the last gift I'll give them, and I hope that one day they understand what it means." That afternoon, Mrs. Celia sat at the table in her room with a sheet of paper and a pen and began writing the letter. Each word was chosen carefully. Each sentence reflected not only the love she had always felt for her children, but also the sadness about the distance that had grown between them. She wrote about the sacrifices she had made, the sleepless nights, the hopes and dreams she had invested in them. But she also expressed her hurt over the neglect and coldness with which they had treated her. However, Mrs. Celia didn't let the letter be just a bitter outpouring. She wanted her children to see beyond her pain and understand what really mattered. With tender words, she spoke about the importance of love, respect, and caring for those who gave us life. In the end, she finished the letter with a line that came from the depths of her soul. "Dear children, know that I forgive you, but I hope you learn that true love isn't based on obligation or money, but on care and respect. May you find in your lives the love I once dreamed we would have for one another." When she was finished, a deep peace washed over her heart. She knew this letter would be her final message to her children, a message that, even after her departure, might help them reflect on their own choices. It was an invisible legacy, more powerful than any material inheritance. The next morning, she handed the letter to the lawyer, who kept it alongside the will. Before leaving, he shook Mrs. Celia's hand and said respectfully, "You are a woman of rare kindness, Mrs. Celia. Few people in your circumstances would show the same generosity." Mrs. Celia smiled, no longer haunted by the bitterness that had once troubled her. "Life teaches us, Doctor, and the greatest lesson I've learned is that forgiveness is the only path to peace." That night, she went to the garden of the nursing home, where Mrs. Helena awaited her with the same serene smile as always. They sat together on a bench, side by side, watching the stars that dotted the dark sky. It was a clear and fresh night, and the silence around them felt comforting, like an invisible embrace. "And so, my friend," asked Mrs. Helena, a curious sparkle in her eyes, "did you do what you needed to do?" Mrs. Celia nodded, gently holding her friend's hand. "Yes, I've made peace with my past and with my children. Now, I feel like I can move forward without anything weighing on my heart." The two sat in silence, just gazing at the sky. Mrs. Celia, at last, felt complete. Despite the abandonment, she had found a new family, a new purpose. And now, she knew her journey was fulfilled. Whatever the future held for her, Mrs. Celia was ready. The peace she felt wasn't fleeting. It was a deep feeling, like a seed of light that had blossomed in her heart. And as she looked up at the starry sky, she smiled, feeling free. Time passed, and Mrs. Celia's health started to show signs of wear. Autumn was approaching, bringing colder winds and falling leaves, as if nature itself mirrored the final cycle of her life. The nursing home doctors came to her room frequently, checking her condition, but even the most dedicated care couldn't fight the natural frailty of age. Mrs. Celia knew her body was saying goodbye, that the strength she once carried was now just a memory. Her children rarely visited. Since the day they left her at the nursing home, their presence had become more and more scarce. Andre and Paolo would come from time to time, but always for brief moments, without any genuine joy. In those few visits, they seemed only interested in checking her condition, as if they were waiting for news that would finally free them from the silent responsibility they still felt toward their mother. Andre arrived with a cold, distant expression, always checking his watch, as if the time spent there was an inconvenient break between more important commitments. "Are you doing well, Mom?" he would ask, but the question sounded so automatic that Mrs. Celia, despite her wounded heart, couldn't bring herself to respond with anything but a sad, polite smile. She didn't want to show how much those visits hurt her, because she knew the affection she sought simply wasn't there anymore. Paolo, on the other hand, was always the most impatient. He almost never stopped to talk, as if he feared that staying longer might bring him more responsibility. "We have to think about practical solutions, Mom. There's no point in you being stubborn," he would say, in a slightly irritated tone, as if her frailty was a personal inconvenience. Even seeing her more weakened, he never showed the affection she once believed he had. Paolo was always in a hurry, his eyes fixed on the future, with no room to understand the present. Juliana was the only one who still hesitated in her coldness, but even she had gradually distanced herself. Occasionally, when she visited, Juliana would look at her with a lost, almost regretful expression, but she lacked the courage to break down the wall she herself had helped build. She sat next to her mother in silence, twisting the handkerchief she carried in her bag, unsure how to start a genuine conversation. During one of these visits, Juliana looked around the room with a certain discomfort. "Mom, I'm sorry things turned out this way," she murmured, her voice tight with emotion, though lacking the resolve of a heartfelt apology. Mrs. Celia touched her daughter's hand, offering a tired, yet loving smile. "It's all right, my dear. I just want you all to be happy, to find peace." With these words, she offered her daughter the forgiveness she had once feared she couldn't give. Deep down, she knew Juliana carried some of the guilt with her, and the last thing Mrs. Celia wanted was to add to the burden her daughter already seemed to bear alone. The nursing home staff, on the other hand, had become her true family. The nurses, caregivers, and even the gardener. All of them treated Mrs. Celia with a respect and affection that gradually filled the emptiness left by her children. Among the friends she made there was Anna, a young nurse with a bright smile and an energy that made each day a little lighter. Anna had a habit of bringing her small flowers from the garden, placing them beside her bed, and chatting with her for long stretches about life, as if they were old friends. "Mother Celia, did you know you're the bravest person I know?" Anna said one afternoon, gently combing her gray hair with care and tenderness. "You always have a kind word for everyone. I've never seen anyone go through so much and still have such a beautiful heart." Mrs. Celia smiled, touched. "Oh, my dear, life has taught me that holding on to grudges only weighs down the heart. And my heart is far too tired to carry anything but love." Anna held Mrs. Celia's hand, her eyes filled with tears. To her, this elderly woman was more than a patient. She was an inspiration. Mrs. Celia embodied everything Anna aspired to be, a strong, generous woman who, despite life's hardships, found a way to smile and embrace those around her. Day after day, Anna and the other nursing home staff took turns making sure Mrs. Celia was always comfortable, always surrounded by affection. When her health declined, they were there, holding her hand, offering words of comfort, never leaving her alone. This was the real family Celia had found, a family not built by blood, but by genuine care and compassion. One morning, feeling particularly weak, Mrs. Celia called for Anna and asked her to bring a Bible. Anna handed her the book, and she held it with reverence, as if it were the last link to the faith that had sustained her throughout her life. With a quiet voice and weary eyes, she read a few verses in silence, feeling each word sink into her soul like a soothing balm. "You are a blessing to all of us, Mother Celia," said Anna as she watched her read. "I'll never forget everything I learned from you." Donna Celia smiled gently. "And I thank God for finding you, my dear. You and everyone here have shown me that love can be found where we least expect it." Those words were spoken with the calmness of someone who had already accepted the end of her journey. Donna Celia felt that her cycle was truly coming to a close. In her nightly prayers, she no longer asked for answers or for the return of her children. Her only prayer was one of gratitude. Gratitude for having found love and care when she needed it most, even if it came from strangers. That night, before going to sleep, she closed her eyes and let her heart fill with peace. She felt her body growing weaker, but her soul felt light, as if it were already preparing for a deeper rest. As she lay down, Donna Celia murmured her last prayers, thanking God for the journey she had lived, for the joys and the pains, and asking for strength for her children, hoping that one day they would find the true meaning of love. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that her time had come. She knew she would soon leave this world, but she was at peace, her heart light, free of resentments, and filled with the affection that the caregivers and friends at the nursing home had given her. In the quiet of the room, as the world slept around her, Donna Celia closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the loving presence of those who truly saw her as a mother. And with a final breath, she left this life with the certainty that true love, the kind she had cultivated throughout her life, would always find a way to bloom, even in the most unlikely places, even among those she never imagined she would call family. With Donna Celia's passing, The nursing home fell silent, as if every corner felt the absence of the lady who, with her strength and serenity, had touched everyone's heart. Anna and the other staff members felt her departure deeply, but also felt honored to have been part of her final days. Dona Celia left in peace, but the legacy of love and forgiveness she had left behind would live on in the hearts of those who were privileged to know her kindness. Now, with her passing, the reading of her will awaited her children, who, unaware of what was coming, would come to the nursing home, convinced that at last, everything belonged to them. The news of Dona Celia's death reached Andre, Paolo, and Juliana on a rainy morning. The call from the nursing home caught them by surprise. Though they knew of their mother's fragile health, none of them were truly prepared for the end. Each reacted in a different way upon receiving the news. Andre, the eldest, received the news with a serious expression but didn't show any emotion. After hanging up the phone, he stayed silent for a few minutes, staring out his office window. He felt a slight discomfort but quickly brushed it off. For him, his mother had lived a long life, and in a way, her passing was just a natural end. Trying to reassure himself that he had done the right thing, he murmured to himself, she was well taken care of, it was the best for her. Paolo, the middle brother, felt something close to relief when he heard the news. He didn't want to admit it to himself, but now that his mother was gone, he imagined the path was clear to address the issues that had been troubling him. What mattered, he thought, was that everything was finally coming to an end and the material concerns would be resolved. He sent a brief message to Andre and Juliana, suggesting they meet for the reading of the will, without any words of mourning or condolence. Juliana, on the other hand, was overwhelmed by a feeling of emptiness. When she hung up the phone, silent tears streamed down her face. Unlike her brothers, she felt a deep pain, mixed with a guilt she had carried for a long time, but that now felt crushing. She remembered the few visits she had made to her mother, the short conversations, the looks she had avoided. A part of her desperately wished time could go back, that she'd have another chance to do everything differently. She felt there was something left unsaid, a goodbye she'd never given, an apology she had never had the courage to make. On the day set for the reading of the will, the three siblings met at the nursing home. It was the first time, since the day they had left their mother there, that they were all returning together. The atmosphere in the nursing home was filled with respect and a quiet sense of reverence. The staff and caregivers, who had become the true family of Mrs. Celia, looked at the three siblings with barely hidden disapproval. Anna, the young nurse who had cared for Mrs. Celia so lovingly, watched them from afar, her eyes misty with sadness and indignation. She knew all that the mother had endured, all she had held in her heart, and saw these children as cold, indifferent strangers who didn't understand the greatness of the woman they had lost. The siblings were greeted by Dr. Roberto, Mrs. Celia's lawyer, who was waiting for them in a small meeting room inside the nursing home. The room was simple, with a wooden table in the center and cushioned chairs. There was a box of tissues on the table and a pitcher of water, as if Dr. Roberto knew the contents of this meeting could bring discomfort. Andre, Paolo, and Juliana sat around the table, side by side, but without much closeness. Dr. Roberto greeted them with a small nod and a solemn look, and then, without any delay, began reading the will. "We are gathered here for the reading of Dona Celia's last wishes," the lawyer began, his voice steady and controlled. "Before she passed away, Dona Celia made some decisions that I think it's wise to share with you fully so that you understand the reasons behind each choice." Andre crossed his arms, remaining impassive, while Paolo showed visible impatience. Juliana, in contrast to her brothers, watched the lawyer with anxious eyes, as if she knew something profound was about to be revealed. Dr. Roberto continued, Dona Celia dedicated her life to you all and saved every asset, every bit of wealth she accumulated, with the intention of providing you with a future. However, in light of the circumstances of her final years, she decided to make some changes to her will, prioritizing those who gave her support and love in her final moments. His words hung heavily in the air. Paolo frowned, trying to grasp the situation. "What are you talking about?" he asked, irritated. "She changed the will? When?" Dr. Roberto looked at him, remaining calm. "Yes, Mr. Paolo. Dona Celia changed the will a few months ago, right here at the nursing home. It was a decision made in full lucidity, and she discussed her motivations with me in detail. You'll see there is nothing improper. It's simply a conscious, well-thought-out choice." Juliana covered her mouth with her hand, feeling a tightening in her chest. What she had feared was becoming a reality, and the guilt she already felt seemed to grow even stronger. Andre, on the other hand, stayed silent, though his face began to show signs of discomfort. Dr. Roberto cleared his throat and continued reading. Dona Celia decided that the majority of her assets will go to the nursing home and to the charities she personally chose. Additionally, part of her inheritance will be distributed among the nurses and caregivers who were with her during her final days. People who, according to her, offered the affection and presence that were denied by those she loved most. There was a heavy silence. Paolo, stunned, muttered, "This is a joke. It can't be real." She was confused. She must have been influenced. Dr. Roberto interrupted him firmly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Paolo, but your mother was of sound mind when she made this decision. She was very clear and explained that, throughout her life, she learned that true love isn't shown through empty words or occasional visits, but through acts of care and presence. And this is how she found her peace, giving her final gift to those who, in her view, truly loved her." Andre opened his mouth to protest, but the lawyer interrupted him once again. "Finally, Dona Celia left a letter for each of you. She asked me to hand them to you personally as her last words. I believe in them. She expresses everything she wanted to say to you." With a serious expression, Dr. Roberto pulled 3 envelopes from his pocket and handed them to his children, one by one. Paolo snatched his envelope with barely restrained anger, as if the paper itself were a provocation. Andre held his with an expression of disdain, reluctant to open it. Juliana, however, looked at the envelope in her hands with tears in her eyes, already feeling the weight of what it contained. The lawyer watched them with a mix of compassion and disapproval. He knew what Dona Celia had gone through, the sacrifices and abandonment she had endured, and, in a way, he felt that justice was being done. With a deep sigh, Juliana was the first to open her letter. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, and her eyes quickly filled with tears as she read her mother's words. "My dear daughter, if you're reading this letter, it's because I'm no longer with you. I want you to know that, despite everything, I loved you deeply. I dedicated my life to you all, and what I did was out of love. But true love isn't something you buy or demand. It's given freely. I'm sorry that circumstances pulled us apart, but I hold no grudge. I only ask that you reflect on what truly matters in life, so that you find the peace I once hoped for us. I forgive you, and I hope one day you can forgive yourself." Juliana began to cry openly, her shoulders shaking silently. Paolo and Andre, reluctantly, opened their letters and found similar words, filled with a tenderness they hadn't expected. Each line seemed to reflect the love their mother still felt, but also the sadness over the distance that had grown between them. "Paolo, my son, I love you and always will. However, what I wish for you is to understand the value of presence, of true affection. Money doesn't bring happiness, and what I leave you isn't material wealth, but a reminder that love is our most precious gift. May God guide you and teach you to love unconditionally. Andre, you were always the strongest, the one I thought would take care of the others. I know life isn't easy, but I hope that one day you realize that, in the end, what we carry isn't what we possess, but what we leave in the hearts of those we touch. May you find peace, my son. As they read, Dr. Roberto watched them with a serene expression. Dona Celia's words were there, clear and firm, leaving a lesson for each of her children. She had left in peace, leaving them one last gift, forgiveness and truth, even if a bit late. The children left the nursing home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Juliana, still crying, was the last to leave, glancing back at the chapel where her mother had spent so many nights in prayer. Deep down, she knew she could never go back, but a seed of change had been planted in her heart. Mrs. Celia was gone, but her legacy would live on forever, not in the form of material goods, but in the profound lesson about the value of true love and forgiveness. As they left the nursing home that rainy morning, Andre, Paolo, and Juliana carried the weight of their mother's last words. Each of them reacted in a different way. Paolo was furious. Andre stayed in a kind of icy silence, and Juliana was still quietly crying, clutching her mother's letter to her chest. But they were all stunned, as they had expected to leave with a secure and guaranteed inheritance, not with letters that, instead of money, offered forgiveness and late advice. However, the biggest shock was yet to come. Days later, the three were summoned to the office of Dr. Roberto, the lawyer, for the formal reading of the will and the official distribution of assets. They expected the document to be a simple formality, confirming the transfer of the house and savings, which they still assumed would be theirs. Upon arrival, they found themselves in an austere room with dark wooden walls and shelves crammed with law books. Dr. Roberto awaited them at the desk, with only a single folder in front of him. No other documents, no additional papers. Paolo was the first to notice, and a look of impatience appeared on his face. "Let's get this over with," he said, almost growling. "What else is there to say? The house is ours, right?" Dr. Roberto remained calm, adjusting his glasses and observing the three siblings with an impassive expression. He knew that what he was about to reveal would be difficult to digest, but his commitment was to Mrs. Celia's memory, not to the children's expectations. "Mr. Paolo," he began in a formal and controlled tone, "I think you haven't fully understood the contents of your mother's will. Mrs. Celia did indeed make significant changes to her inheritance, and I ask that you listen carefully to the end." Andre, frowning, leaned forward. "I want to believe this is just a misunderstanding, Doctor. Our mother worked her whole life for us. She wouldn't do something to hurt us. You may see this as a punishment, but that wasn't Mrs. Celia's intention," Dr. Roberto explained. "Quite the opposite. She made these decisions not out of anger or revenge, but because she believed love is something shown through actions, not just words." The lawyer picked up the folder in front of him and took out a copy of the final will, reading Mrs. Celia's words with a solemnity that filled the room with an almost palpable tension. "I declare that after a life of work and sacrifices dedicated to my children, I understood, in my final years, the true value of love and presence. I learned that true love cannot be bought or demanded, and that it is found in the sincere gestures of those around us. Therefore, I leave most of my assets, including my house, my savings, and any remaining amount, to the nursing home where I spent my last days and to the charities I chose, so that this money may be used to support and shelter those in need." The words echoed through the room, and the silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the children's heavy breathing. Andre and Paolo exchanged incredulous looks, while Juliana seemed frozen, her eyes fixed on the lawyer, as if waiting for an explanation. a justification for what she had just heard. "It can't be," murmured Paolo, his face flushed with growing anger. "She was our mother. We had a right to that inheritance. How could she do this to us?" Dr. Roberto looked at him with a calm but firm gaze. "Mr. Paolo, as I mentioned, your mother was of sound mind and made this choice with conviction. She explained that her decision was based on the last years of her life, in moments when she felt abandoned and alone. Mrs. Celia told me about the kindness she received from the nursing home staff, people who, though strangers, treated her like family. Your mother wanted her legacy to go to those who showed her love." Andre crossed his arms, shaking his head in frustration and disbelief. "This is ridiculous. Our mother must have been influenced by someone. You must have put ideas in her head. She didn't know what she was doing." Dr. Roberto interrupted him, his tone firm. "Don't say that, Mr. Andre." Mrs. Celia was perfectly lucid. "And once again, I stress that there was nothing wrong with her judgment. She made it clear that this was her will and that she hoped, one day, you would understand the real reason behind her decision." Juliana began to cry silently, and for the first time, she felt unable to hold back the pain and guilt that overwhelmed her. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind, about forgiveness, love, the hope that one day she might change. The letter she received from Mrs. Celia felt as heavy as lead in her hands. The reality of what they had done, of how they had treated their mother, was becoming painfully clear. It was as if a fog of illusion and excuses she had maintained until now was dissipating, revealing the true cost of their choices. Paolo, however, couldn't hold back and slammed his hand on the table, his voice filled with indignation. "This is an injustice. It's not fair that everything she built should end up with strangers. We are her family. We should be the heirs." Dr. Roberto remained calm, but his voice took on a sharp tone. "Mr. Paolo, with all due respect, family isn't just about blood. The real family for Mrs. Celia in these last years were those who stood by her side, who offered her affection when she needed it most. It was people like Anna, the nurse who cared for her daily, and the staff at the nursing home who treated her with dignity and kindness." Paolo opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The lawyer's words struck him like a silent blow, and as he looked at his siblings, he noticed that even Andre, always so firm, was speechless, lost in an expression of disbelief. Juliana, huddled in her chair, no longer tried to hide her tears. The tension in the room was palpable. It was as if the children were finally beginning to face the reflection of their own choices, seeing in it the consequences of their coldness, the indifference they had shown their mother. That inheritance, which once seemed so certain, was slipping from their hands like sand. Mrs. Celia had indeed left them something, but it wasn't what they expected. She had left them a painful lesson, a testament of love, and the proof that the true legacy one leaves in the world is the respect and care one gives and receives. After a few moments of silence, Dr. Roberto continued, now with a gentler tone, almost as if offering comfort. "Mrs. Celia didn't leave you empty-handed. She included a symbolic amount for each of you as a keepsake. But what she wanted you to understand, more than any material possession, was the importance of valuing human connections. To care for those we love while we still have the chance." He slid 3 envelopes toward the children, each containing a modest check. They looked at the checks with a mix of disdain and sadness. The amount was almost insignificant compared to what they had expected. But at the same time, there was symbolism in it, a reminder that their mother hadn't forgotten them, but had chosen to give real value to those who truly loved her. Juliana took the envelope and held it against her chest, tears streaming freely. For the first time, she felt genuinely remorseful. She felt a pain she couldn't describe, a pain not over the lost inheritance, but over the mother they had let slip away alone, the chance they had and wasted to be there for her. Andre and Paolo remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts, unable to face Juliana's tears or the silent accusations that hung in the air. That reading, that final encounter with their mother's legacy, had revealed to them a bitter and inescapable truth. Mrs. Celia was gone, but she had left behind a powerful lesson. And now they would have to live with the awareness that the true value in life, the one their mother tried to show them until the very end, is made of love, presence, and care, something that no amount of money in the world could replace. And so, with envelopes empty of fortune but filled with an invisible weight, the three of them left Dr. Roberto's office, each carrying for the rest of their lives the lesson that Donna Celia had left them. The days following the reading of the will were heavy for Andre, Paolo, and Juliana. Each one dealt with their mother's revelations in their own way, but all of them carried, to some extent, a lingering guilt that refused to be ignored. What once seemed so certain, their right to the inheritance, the justification of the nursing home as the best for her, now felt hollow, unfounded. Like a broken shell, their certainties had crumbled, revealing the true cost of their decisions. Andre, always the most rational and detached, tried to carry on with his routine as if nothing had happened. However, in the quiet of the nights, his mother's words in the letter he received echoed in his mind. There was no bitterness in those words. On the contrary, she spoke with love, with the hope that he would learn the value of human relationships. He found himself forced to reflect on his own life, so filled with ambitions and goals, yet empty of true connections. Looking around, he realized he maintained the same emotional walls with his own wife and children. For the first time, Andre began to understand that his distance and coldness didn't protect anyone. It only pushed away those he loved. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he confided in his wife, Clara, about what had happened. Clara listened attentively and, at the end, placed her hand over his and asked, with a soft but firm tone, "Andre, do you want your children to feel the same way about you as your mother did? Do you want them, someday, to turn their backs on you?" That question struck him deeply. Andre remained silent, grasping the magnitude of his choices. He knew he needed to change, but he also knew that regret wouldn't undo the past. All that was left was to try, little by little, to rebuild his life with more attention and presence, so that one day he might finally be able to forgive himself. Paolo, on the other hand, seemed more resistant to reflection. At first, he showed nothing but resentment toward his mother's decision. He felt robbed, wronged, and spent his days brooding over the loss of the inheritance. But beneath the anger, a deeper unease was beginning to surface, something he was reluctant to admit. The awareness that, deep down, they had truly failed their mother. One night, Paolo went out to drink alone at a nearby bar, trying to drown the discomfort that had haunted him since the reading of the will. But the alcohol didn't bring the relief he was hoping for. In fact, as the early hours passed, his anger and frustration started to turn into sadness. Childhood memories came flooding back, memories he had buried under layers of indifference and justifications. He remembered Donna Celia holding his hand when he fell ill at age 8, staying up all night by his side. He recalled how she taught him to ride a bike, holding onto the seat and running alongside him until he could pedal on his own. These memories opened a wound Paolo hardly knew existed. Suddenly, he realized that the lost inheritance was insignificant compared to the emptiness he now felt for never having valued his mother's love. Amidst the muffled noise of the bar, he whispered to himself, "I'm sorry, Mom." And, with tears he had never allowed before, he cried there, alone, with no one to see him. For Juliana, the The process of regret came with a more immediate and devastating pain. Ever since the day of the will reading, she had felt the weight of her mother's absence like a constant presence. She remembered every short, cold visit, every time she avoided a deep conversation with Donna Celia, every excuse she gave to avoid spending more time with her. Her mother's words in the letter, that she forgave her and hoped Juliana could forgive herself, were both a relief and a torture. She couldn't stop thinking about the nurses and staff at the nursing home who had become Donna Celia's true family. It filled her with overwhelming shame. She felt small, selfish, and didn't know how to deal with the pain of loss mixed with regret. One night, unable to bear the weight on her heart any longer, Juliana decided to return to the nursing home. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she felt a desperate need to connect in some way with her mother's last memories. When she arrived at the nursing home, she was welcomed by Anna, the nurse who had cared for Donna Celia until her final days. Anna recognized Juliana immediately, and her eyes, usually so gentle, were filled with a silent pain. "I was hoping you would come," she said in a calm but firm voice. Juliana, not knowing what to say, murmured, I needed to see the place where my mother spent her last days. I need to understand how she lived here." Anna nodded and, without words, led Juliana through the silent halls of the nursing home. They stopped in front of the room where Donna Celia had lived. It was a simple space with a bed, a small bedside table, and a chair by the window. On the table, there was still a vase with a wilted flower, left there since the last time Anna had placed it to brighten the room. Juliana entered the room with hesitant steps, feeling her mother's presence in every corner. She touched the bed, sat on the chair, and finally let her tears flow freely. "I was a terrible daughter," she whispered, her voice choked. "I should have been here, should have stayed by her side." Anna approached and gently placed her hand on Juliana's shoulder, with a kindness that seemed endless. "Your mother talked about you. She always said she believed that one day you would understand. She never held a grudge." These words broke Juliana's heart and at the same time brought her an unexpected sense of comfort. Sitting there in the empty room, she felt as if her mother were right beside her, offering the forgiveness she had never had the courage to ask for. Before leaving, Anna handed her a small photo she'd found among Donna Celia's things. It was an old picture of Juliana as a little girl, smiling next to her mother. She kept this picture close, Anna said. It was one of the few things she wanted to keep near her. Juliana held the photo to her chest, feeling a mix of pain and tenderness. She promised herself, in that moment, that she would change her life, that she would honor her mother's memory by being a better person, someone who cherished love in every small way it appeared. Days turned into weeks, and Donna Celia's departure continued to transform the lives of her 3 children. Each of them, in their own way, started making changes in their routines, in their relationships. Andre began spending more time with his children, trying to be a more present father and committing to break the cycle of coldness he himself had inherited. Paolo sought help to deal with his anger and frustration, starting to understand that his unhappiness didn't come from a lack of money, but from a lack of genuine connections. And Juliana, still visiting the nursing home from time to time, became a volunteer, helping care for the elderly and trying, in some way, to offer to others the care she hadn't known how to give her own mother. In the end, Donna Celia was gone, but she had left an indelible mark on her children's lives. Her legacy wasn't one of material things, but of a profound and transformative life lesson, a legacy that made them confront their own shortcomings and, ironically, offered them a chance at redemption. Now, whenever they thought of their mother, they no longer thought of the house, the savings, or the lost inheritance. They thought of childhood memories, of her sacrifices, of the kindness she showed until the very end. And in their silent prayers, each of them asked the same thing: that Dona Celia forgive them for taking so long to understand the true meaning of love. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.